Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Centre for International Governance Innovation. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG. Thanks to everyone here tonight for coming out amid the first real blast of Canadian winter. I congratulate you on your hardiness. I'd also like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. This evening's lecture is also co-sponsored by the Balsley School of International Affairs, and we thank them for their contributions. We also thank everyone who's joining us live online through the CG Live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences here in the auditorium, at the microphones at the ends of the aisles, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're at home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Canada's migrant policies have received heavy criticism in recent days for the treatment of migrants from countries with widespread and persistent intense transmission of the Ebola virus. The fear-based discourse perpetuates a familiar political message framing migrants as security risks. Tonight, Dr. François Crépeau will speak to us about shifting migrant discourse and policies to help create engaged and empowered migrant communities. Dr. Crépeau will also discuss the progress made toward a comprehensive governance framework for global migration. Here to introduce tonight's speaker, we'll have Suzanne Ilken, Director of the Master of Arts in Global Governance program and Professor at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And following the lecture, Kim Rigel, Associate Professor at the Balsley School, will moderate the question and answer period. Suzanne Ilken teaches in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo, in addition to her roles at the BSIA. Her research interests include poverty and social policy, humanitarian aid and refugee camps, and social justice and citizenship rights. Kim Rigel is faculty of Wilfrid Laurier University and teaches in the Master of International Public Policy program at the Balsley School. She's also a research associate with Laurier's International Migration Research Center. We look forward to her moderation later in the evening. So please join me now in welcoming Suzanne to introduce the speaker.
Good evening. Thank you, Fred. Many of us will have heard in the news recently about such recent events as the federal court's decision declaring unconstitutional the Government of Canada's cuts to health care for refugees, or about the growing number of migrants fleeing war and economic hardship and facing hazardous journeys, sometimes death, as they try to cross into Europe. We are very fortunate tonight to have Dr. François Crépeau with us to speak about such issues. Dr. Crépeau is a full professor and is the Hans and Tamar Professor in International Law in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He holds diplomas from McGill University, Bordeaux University, and Paris II University. He received his PhD in law from Paris I University. In 2011, he received a long-term appointment as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. This special appointment was first created in 1999 by the UN Commission on Human Rights. Its main functions include examining ways to overcome the obstacles to the protection of the human rights of migrants, recognizing the particular vulnerability of women, children, and undocumented persons. Also, collecting information on the violations of the human rights of migrants, and recommending actions at national, regional, and international levels to eliminate violations of the human rights of migrants. Today, there are some 232 million migrants. Some are forced to migrate as a result of poverty, discrimination, natural disasters, enormous conflict, and massive social unrest. During migration, and especially when crossing borders, many face exploitation, abuse, and other human rights violations. Dr. Crépeau's work focuses on these kinds of migrant and human rights abuses. In his capacity as Special Rapporteur, he has studied the UN Millennium Development Goals with respect to marginalized migrant populations and the challenges they face in terms of human rights abuses. He has also examined the management of the external borders of the European Union and its impact on the human rights of migrants. He held consultations with the European Union in Brussels and carried out visits to countries on both sides of the EU's external borders: Greece, Italy, Tunisia, and Turkey. In these countries, he visited detention centers, shelters, and other accommodations, as well as observing border crossings. Here, he witnessed inadequate procedures for detention, the detention of children and families, the prison-like conditions, and the criminalization of migrants for an irregular crossing or an attempt. Dr. Crépeau's human rights work has emphasized that the increasing practice of migration detention within and outside the European Union is not automatically accompanied by the assurance of the legal guarantees and basic human rights protection for detainees. He has called for alternatives to detention, for the necessity to learn from migrants themselves, and for them to form a political constituency, and for the recognition that all migrants are rights holders, such as having the right to health, education, due process within the law, and the right not to be tortured. Dr. Crépeau has given many conference addresses. He has published numerous articles, books, and reports. His research has focused on migration control mechanisms, the boundary between security and migration, the interface between the rule of law and globalization, and the rights and freedoms of migrants. Please join me in welcoming Dr. François Crépeau.
Many thanks, Susan, for this generous introduction. I'd like to thank the organizers, Fred Kuntz in particular, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you in this bad weather. Although it's the beginning of winter, it's still nice to see snow. Won't last. You've learned quite a lot of what I do already. I've titled my presentation Between Myths and Crises, Rethinking Migration Policies. I will guide you through a series of ideas about why we are not thinking properly about migration policies. What are the angles that we're not seeing when we're talking about migration policies? And why the migration policies we are adopting and implementing are certainly in many cases and in many countries missing completely the issue of protecting the human rights of migrants who are in a precarious situation. My UN mandate is about the human rights of migrants, and I'm interested in particular in two categories of migrants who have a very precarious status: undocumented migrants and temporary migrant workers. In both cases, they have either no status or a very precarious status, which creates enormous problems for them to affirm and protect their own human rights. Am I doing this right? Is it on? No, it's not on. Got it. Yep. Very quickly, the first point I'd like to make is that we're all migrants. This is sort of counterintuitive. We say that we're a country of migrants, yes. But we don't think of ourselves individually as migrants. We think of ourselves as settled. Because migration is often a generational issue. But if I ask the question, and I'm asking it to you, and I do that quite often with audiences, how many of you live today in the city of birth of your 4 grandparents? I usually have 1 or 2 hands. Not many. We have an immigration, we all have in this room, I haven't seen 1 hand, we all have an immigration story from less than 2 generations. And if I ask the question about the country of origin of the 4 grandparents, I usually have 2/3 of the audience who don't raise their hand. We're all migrants, and we don't think, it's counterintuitive. We think migrants are the others. We are the settled people. Settlement is civilization, migration, nomadic behavior is not quite civilization. It's a transition period. In fact, and that's my point here, migration is the normal state of mankind. That's what we've done since we came out, since we all issued from that African mother of all of us 200,000 years ago. We all come down from one single woman in Africa 200,000 years ago. And we've migrated throughout the planet. We've colonized Australia 60,000 years ago. We've colonized Europe about 40,000 years ago. We came to the Americas about 16,000 years ago. And we've migrated. We always do that. We go on holidays, we go on pilgrimage, we do internships, we go to college, we always move. But we don't see ourselves as migrants. The migrants are the others, those we see on TV. And therefore migration is not the exception. It's settlement, which is the exception. We don't really consider that, but that's something that we should start thinking about. And this means that migration can't be stopped. Migration is in our genes. That's who we are. And it can't be stopped. It can be slowed, it can be diverted, but it can't be stopped. And there is somewhere here a contradiction with the dominant political discourse that we hear. Because up till now, there are democracy and development differentials on this planet. And people will always go to where there is less security and less economic stability, to places where they think they have better opportunities for themselves and their children. And this is just a normal and natural human behavior. And we'll have to adapt to this idea. My second point is that migrants have rights. That's also counterintuitive. I had a meeting with a very well-known French-Canadian journalist of Radio-Canada who had been correspondent in Washington and Paris. He was a star. And he was doing this piece on undocumented migrants in Montreal. And I told him, well, migrants benefit from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And he turns around and says, how come they benefit from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? I thought they were illegals. So if this star journalist of Radio-Canada didn't get it, it's counterintuitive for many of us. Migrants have all the rights, the fundamental rights of the citizen, because we're all humans, and except 2, the right to vote and be elected, and the right to enter and stay in the country. These are 2 rights which are reserved to citizens in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All other rights are for everyone, without exception. This includes the right to equality, being treated the same. Which means that if we create distinctions based on nationality or immigration status, we have to justify it. Otherwise, it is a discrimination, and it is forbidden in international law and in constitutional law. So there's a right there for migrants as for everyone else. This doesn't mean that we all have the same entitlements in terms of government programs. I don't have the right to my pension. I don't fit the age criteria yet. It's coming, but not yet. I don't have the right to prenatal care. I'm not a woman, and I'm not pregnant. There are criteria for entitlements, government program entitlements. But the fundamental rights, we are all on the same plane except for those 2 limited rights that I've mentioned. And this stems from the idea that the migrant's dignity is not different from ours. The idea that we can't be tortured, the idea that we must be treated equally unless there's a good reason for it, and the one who wants to treat us unequally has to prove it. That we have the right to, due process, that we have the right to an education. Why should migrant kids not have the right to go to school? What have they done to be deprived of something which is key to the development they need now for the rest of their lives? We can't say, oh, when they'll get back home, they'll have their education. No, it's now they need to learn to write and read and count. The third idea is that irregular migration is not a crime. It is portrayed as a crime in the political discourse. The irregular migrant is criminalized, is presented as part of a criminal activity. It certainly is a violation of an administrative regulation. You're supposed to go through a normal entry point and to present the appropriate documents to enter the country. Or you're supposed to go back home after your, just before your visa expires. These are the two ways of becoming undocumented. These are administrative regulations. They, should be obeyed. If they're not, there should be a penalty of some kind. But that's not a crime. It's like the difference between, parking where it's not authorized and dangerous driving. Parking where it's not authorized is an administrative violation, and we have to pay a fine for that. Sometimes it's hefty. But dangerous driving is a crime. So there are two different things here. Irregular migration is not a crime. It's not a crime against persons, no one's hurt. It's not a crime against property, nothing's broken. And it's not a crime against security. 99.99% of migrants are not a security risk for states, period. So there's no crime committed. There might be a crime committed on the occasion of an irregular border crossing. That may happen, but that's a specific event. Doesn't make the whole of the irregular migrants criminals. But the criminalization is a tendency. You hear that in the discourse. Now, it's a tendency which is part of a much bigger tendency, which political scientists have called the securitization of the public space. Especially since the oil shocks of the 70s, states have tried to legitimize their action through securitizing. And now we're talking about energy security, water security, climate security, immigration. Everything is securitized because that's a way of legitimizing government action. And certainly immigration security has been emphasized, especially already before, but especially after 9/11, when ideas like those are irregular migrants who crossed into the US to wreak havoc. Well, they were not irregular migrants. They had been given visas by the authorities. I mean, they came from Canada, another type of thing. They immigrated from Canada, so they're dangerous. These are fantasies. They came through normal immigration processes, and they were vetted by the American authorities. So this idea of securitization of migration existed since the 90s in Europe, but has been very prominently presented since 9/11. Now, the interesting thing is that criminalization in the discourse doesn't mean that the state is using criminal law against irregular migrants. No. Criminal law has rules of evidence and rules of procedure which are very stringent, including the presumption of innocence. It's much easier to use administrative law, which has much laxer rules of evidence and rules of procedure. And so we can detain people in administrative law much more easily than we can do in criminal law. And so the criminalization of the discourse doesn't correspond to a criminalization in the procedures. And here we see the discrepancy. Here we see where the use of government discretion in order to manage migration has been very important and has been increased in many countries. The government discretion, in particular the discretion of the minister to make decisions about foreigners, individual foreigners, has been vastly expanded. We have to understand also that if migrants come here or any immigration country, if irregular migrants come, it's because there's a reason. And the reason can come from the push factors, which have been mentioned, poverty, instability at home. But there are also pull factors. And one big pull factor in most countries of immigration are underground labor markets in many sectors of the economy. In Canada, certainly, in agriculture, in construction, in caregiving, and in hospitality, we employ hundreds of thousands of irregular migrants. In other countries, in fisheries and in the mining industry, also millions of irregular migrants are being employed. And when I say employed, I often mean exploited. We have tolerated in our countries underground labor markets that constitute a form of subsidy to industries which would not be competitive otherwise. You know, what should be the cost of your strawberry basket in June if it was picked by, you know, our children? Let's imagine our children at student age, and they are offered to go pick strawberries in the north of Quebec. How much would they ask per hour? And how much are the irregular migrants paid? So there's an issue here. We have accepted that many of our industries survive because of the exploitation of irregular migrants. And they know that they have a job, so they come for that. If we were to reduce those underground labor markets, we would reduce the pull factor. We would not eliminate irregular migration, but would reduce the pull factor. And we're not doing this for the moment. And by not doing this, we are co-responsible of the irregular migration that comes to Canada. Now, I haven't heard any country of the global north taking responsibility or co-responsibility for irregular migration. It's always them coming to us to take our jobs. It's never us, you know, allowing them to come and hoping that they would come. And certainly the employers that need them to exploit them hope that they will come and that they will be able to cross the borders. And so when we hear ministers say that they will close the border once and for all and stop this, we know it's not true, because they will have constituents who will come to the office on Saturday and tell them, you can't do this, I need these guys. And that's very important. And in that sense, we're also co-responsible, and that's mostly in Europe, but also in the US, off the coast of Florida, and in Australia, we're co-responsible for death at sea. If we allow deaths at sea to happen, it's because we have decided that putting barriers and pushing these people in the hands of smugglers, of unscrupulous smugglers, is actually a price we're ready to pay in order to make sure that not that many people come, but enough to service those sectors of the economy that need them. So we're co-responsible of those deaths, and I haven't heard any country take ownership for that. If we talk now about the other category I'm interested in, the temporary migrant workers, who come to Canada, Australia, but also to Qatar, and I visited Qatar as one of my missions. In Qatar, you have 250,000 citizens and 1.8 million temporary migrant workers. That's 87% of the population are temporary migrant workers, including bankers, lawyers, doctors, nurses, engineers. They're all temporary migrant workers. Well, they have different social capitals, depending on who they are. I'm sure that a lawyer and a doctor have more social capital than the construction worker or the maid, but they're all on a temporary migrant worker status that has to be renewed every year. In Canada, we have a temporary migrant worker program, in Australia as well, in the UK, in Europe, in many. It's a trend all throughout the world, and especially in the global north, to have more and more temporary migrant work in order to provide for needs in the economy, labor needs in the economy, which tend to be permanent. We cope with permanent needs in the economy with temporary labor work. Now, these policies about temporary migrant work, why do we want temporary migrant work? We want temporary migrant work for targeted employment, targeted jobs, and we want them at the lower cost, at the lowest cost possible. And that is what the temporary migrant work program provides. Very often in these sponsorship programs, as they're called, the migrant worker will come and will have a visa and a residence visa and a work permit and a residence permit to work for one person only, for one specified job only. This means that if that person is fired tomorrow, that person loses the work permit and the residence permits and must go home. Now we have to understand that many temporary migrant workers go into huge debt in order to realize this migration project they have for their whole family. They want to come here or to Europe or to Australia, work for a number of years while someone else takes care of their kids, work for a number of years, send money home in order to provide for the kids to go to school and buy the books, etc., build another room to the house. And when they have accumulated enough money, they'll go back home and live with their family. That's the project. If after 1 year they're fired, they haven't been able to send 1 cent home because everything they've been sending was to pay the debt. The intermediaries that have provided them with that job, the recruiters. And they're sent home having not paid their debt, and it's a disaster. It's a disaster for everyone. So what happens? The employers know that everywhere, Canada and Qatar, everywhere. The employers know that, and the employers will take advantage of that and will ask them to do things that they shouldn't be asked to do, like work 7 days a week, like work from 7 in the morning to 11 at night, like work in 2 houses. Maids are often asked to work in the parents' house and then in the daughter's house and have several jobs at the same time. Not being paid for 6 months, not being paid for a year. But what can they do? If they protest, they'll be fired. So they don't protest, they just continue to work and hope that the money will come by at one point. And this happens in the construction industry in Qatar, for example. They wait for a whole year for their salary. So by creating systems like sponsorship systems, we are actually creating a precarious environment in which the migrant worker has no choice but to accept the conditions. And we know that. These people are often in the same situation as industrial workers were at the beginning of the 20th century. It's for this kind of situation that unions were created 150 years ago. And we still have recreated that today in our midst. And we are now preventing, for example, in Quebec at present, there's a bill that would prevent agricultural workers from unionizing. Interesting. And we know that. This is something that has been studied by social science. We are responsible for creating a system that is based on exploitation. It doesn't verge on, on slavery as it does maybe in Qatar in many cases. But still, there's lots of exploitation and there's lots of misery and lots of people who are going back home with a broken migration dream and a huge debts. One of the reasons why we have a situation like this is because we have irresponsible political discourses about migration. And when I say irresponsible, I mean technically irresponsible. I don't mean that all politicians are irresponsible by nature. That's not my point. democracies are good at representing citizens. We have MPs, members of parliament, and we are represented. Foreigners are not. Electoral democracies, and we can't criticize because it's the best system that we've ever invented to govern ourselves. But electoral democracies have a blind angle, have a black spot. Electoral democracies cannot represent foreigners. In Switzerland, 24% of the population is foreign. They pay taxes, not much, mind you. They obey the law. They live in Switzerland sometimes for decades. They never vote. They never participate in public debates. In Canada, we have that to a lesser degree, but we have that certainly for temporary migrant workers who may be working in our midst for long periods of time and still never have access to any kind of public participation. So the issue here is that, especially for migrants in a precarious situation, like undocumented migrants and temporary migrant workers, we have to understand that they live in fear. They live in fear of being detected, detained, and deported. And the systems that we have established to employ them are counting on this. That's where the exploitation is possible. It's because they fear speaking up. They fear protesting. They don't mobilize. They barely want to touch unions with a 10-foot pole because they fear being detected. They fear, sticking their neck out. Only when they're desperate will they do that. But very often, the strategy of the migrant is to move on. I haven't been paid for 6 months. Okay, let's forget about it. That was a bad patch. I'll find a new employer and I'll get paid and I'll send money home. That's what they do if they can. And so it is difficult when you don't have access to the political stage to actually defend your rights. What did women do? They fought for the right to vote and be elected and be heard. And then they fought to be members of parties and to make sure that those parties would reflect their interests and their ideas and would take up their issues and present them at the next election and win the election and then implement that. And there was a first minister who was a woman, and there was a first series of policies regarding women. That's what they did. That's what Aboriginals did. That's what gays and lesbians did. That's what persons with disabilities did. They fought for equal citizenship. This is not going to happen for migrants. They're not citizens. They don't vote. Parties don't take up their issues. And that's one problem we have because of the general nationalist populist discourse that we hear about migration and that we've heard for 25 years in Europe, certainly since 9/11 in North America. Migrants are a threat. Migrants are a problem. We need them, but not all of them. This is suspicious. And we have all come as citizens, we have all come to sort of fear some types of migrants. And that nationalist populist discourse is easy to carry for years without contradiction because there's no electorate out there to reward you as a politician if you speak up in favor of migrants. But there is a political base for migrant bashing, and you certainly get points for doing migrant bashing. And that is a problem that all countries face. If you look at Australia, if you look at the UK, if you look at France, policies of left and right towards irregular migration and temporary migrant workers are exactly the same. The Liberals and Labour in Australia, the Tories and Labour in the UK, Emmanuel Valls and Nicolas Sarkozy in France, they do exactly the same thing. Why? Because there's no electoral reward for doing the right thing, because they don't vote. And we citizens don't care, collectively. Yes, churches do a good job, good lawyers will do pro bono work, NGOs, but not one single party that has a chance of governing will take up issues that will risk costing points in the polls. And that's why we use, and that's interesting I find, we use liquid language regarding migrants. We always talk about waves of migration, migration flows. We talk about the trickling of migrants through the border. We talk, some politicians use the hyperbole of tsunamis of migrants, etc. You have to contain the migration. Why? Because a liquid image portrays a mass which is not individualized. It's a threatening mass with no faces, no individualities. It's a big mass. And if we ask to Canadians or other people, for example, are there too many Muslims in this country? They will say, oh yes, there are too many Muslims. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they are changing our culture. We don't like that. But Mohammed is a good guy. I know him, He's nice. I would like him to stay. Because you have this indeterminate mass that is portrayed as dangerous, as a threat, this fantasy that is presented to us. But when they have specific knowledge of individuals, they discover that these individuals are just like us. They may have a different religion, different skin color, different cooking habits, whatever. But they are, good citizens, taxpayers, parents. They just want the same type of life that we do. So we need to embrace these challenges. And we will have to fight those nationalist, populist discourses that we hear all the time. But it'll be difficult as long as migrants will not be represented. And that's why we might have to think of distinguishing citizenship from nationality. And we might have to think of recognizing people who've lived here a long time as citizens, even though they're not nationals. But if you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. And that's something that we have to think about. It's not for tomorrow. One of the problems we have, and one of the problems I face when I talk about the human rights of migrants, is that I seem to be utterly without traction with a certain kind of audience. And I've discovered why by reading a book, which is Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. And this is social psychology, and I'm not qualified to talk about that, but I'm just telling you what he says, and it makes sense to me, so I share that with you. He says, we make our moral decisions on 6 criteria: care, freedom, fairness, authority, loyalty, sanctity. And he divides the world in 2. The minds that are liberal and the minds that are conservative, not in Canadian political terms, but in political science terms. And he says the liberal mind is usually using the first 3 criteria only: care, freedom, fairness. And that's the human rights discourse. It's a distinctly liberal discourse. We don't use authority, we don't use loyalty, and we don't use sanctity. Conservative minds use all 6 criteria. And we can understand, if we look at the American debate, the authority argument is that they've broken the law. Why should we reward them with amnesty? Loyalty, why give them access to citizenship? I mean, they've shown their disloyalty to the state by breaking the law. And sanctity is the fact that in much faith-based conservative outfits who care and have very good support for migrants and refugees, those policies are based on charity, not on rights. And that's part of according to Jonathan Haidt, it's part of the conservative mind. And so, by reading this, I understood that my human rights discourse did not address the authority argument, the loyalty argument, and the sanctity argument. And we, liberals, and I clearly qualify as a liberal, will have to recognize that and include that in our discourse if we want to be heard by a good part of the population. And up till now, we haven't really been able to do that. one of the ways through which we should be able to do it is by promoting the fact that migrants would speak with their own voice, and that that voice would be heard. At the moment it can't, because there's no political space for that. We talk about migrants, we make policies about migrants. We know that. You know the slogan of persons with disabilities, nothing about us without us? Well, this is what happens for migrants all the time. All migration policies are made about migrants without migrants. They never participate in the elaboration and implementation of policies except by being detained and deported. So we are going to have to allow them to speak up and participate in that public debate in one way or another. One silver lining, and I'm sorry about this slide, which is full of acronyms, and I had been told not to put acronyms on the slide, but I won't dwell on it too much. One silver lining in that a bit despairing portrayal that I'm making of the situation is that at global level, there seems to be, above the toxic national debates that we're having in each of our countries, there seem to be a better understanding of the situation at the UN, but also outside the UN between states, at the EU up to a certain point, the European Union level as well. These are levels where there's no election coming in the next 6 months, and we can discuss differently if we have the assurance that whatever we say will not come back to haunt us in the next election. So we have a series of fora where states get together to discuss migration issues, especially the Global Forum on Migration and Development, GFMD, where 150 states now come together every year to discuss good practices and lessons learned, including on integration, including on border control, including on many things. And they try to understand what the others do and how they do well and how they do less well and why. And they invite people from academia, and they invite people like me who have a mandate on human rights issues, and they invite people from business communities to talk to them about what type of migrants they need and why and how. And in those discussions, which have started in 2006, it's 8 years old, it's very recent. Human rights have crept into those discussions. They started as discussions about economic migration, but human rights has crept into that. And since 2010, at the GFMD, human rights is an essential, an integral part of those discussions. What I find as a silver lining here is that states might be able, at that level, where there's no electoral challenge in the coming months and years, might be able to develop a sophisticated counter-discourse that they will be able to bring down to their political stage and say to the nationalist populist opponent, well, you can continue with your fantasies and your threats, but we have agreed with a number of neighboring states on a policy, and it's going to make sense economically, politically, and at the human rights level. And they might be able to oppose, without losing too many points in the polls, the nationalist populist fantasies and threats. And so I find that this is somewhat reassuring. There's something that's going to happen. Mind you, I don't think it will change the game in the short term. I fear that this change will be a generational change, that it's our kids who have a different outlook on the world and have a different outlook on diversity, who will be able to implement that. This means that we might have to wait 25 to 30 years. And that's a bit disappointing, I find. But the last point I'd like to make is that the only way to change this, and this is going to take time, is actually to allow, and that's what I was saying before, to allow for the migrant voice to be heard. Migrants are being, and when I'm saying migrants, I'm saying undocumented migrants and temporary migrant workers, vulnerable, precarious migrants, are being silenced by the systems, by the precariousness in which we have put them. And we have to find ways for them to be able to voice their concerns, to speak up, to protest, to contest decisions taken about them or in their name. Where can that happen? In our democracies, a contemporary democracy is made of certainly representation, but also human rights guarantees and the rule of law. If we can't use representation, well, we have to use human rights guarantees and the rule of law. That's all we have. So, where can the voice of migrants be heard? In the courts. So, courts, administrative tribunals, all these decision-making bodies are very important. Now, we know that access to justice is difficult. It's already difficult for citizens. Legal aid has been cut. Pro bono lawyer programs are always, on the brink of being abolished because there's no money, there's no political will to support that. So access to justice is difficult for citizens already. For migrants who don't speak the language, who don't understand the law, who don't know a lawyer, it's even more difficult. But some good lawyers, some good NGOs, churches are actually doing a good job at connecting people, and they are winning a number of cases. There have been very good decisions by the Canadian Supreme Court, the American Supreme Court, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, the British Supreme Court has been excellent on many issues to tell the government, you can't do this. One example is that British Supreme Court decision, House of Lords, which told the British government that they could not put government agents at Prague airport to prevent Czech citizens who looked Roma to board the plane towards London. The government defended that decision, which is utter discrimination, racial discrimination, defended that decision up to the Supreme Court. They thought they could get away with it. And the Supreme Court was very scathing on that. So courts can do that because they don't have electoral pressure. The other level are national human rights institutions. Human rights commissions, ombudspersons, Defensor del Pueblo, all these institutions that are there to investigate, to document discrimination. They have had difficulty touching migration issues because it's controversial, because it's linked to territorial sovereignty. They hesitated. The Quebec Human Rights Commission was created in 1975. Its first report on immigration was 2011. It took them almost 40 years to get there. But now they have a good report on temporary migrant worker programs. And they said they should be completely transformed. And both Quebec government and federal government were not happy. But I think that's a good point. At least this commission did the right thing for that. And I've seen that in other countries as well. What I've seen also is that during the debt crisis of the past few years, many human rights commissions in Europe, for example, have simply lost their budget, can't do anything anymore. So they have been emasculated. What else do we have? We have NGOs, we have churches, we have unions. Unions are interested in migrant workers now. Unions are interested in migrant workers because migrant workers are actually today what industrial workers were 140 years ago. They are people who have no voice and who need to be, to get together to find their voice and fight for better work conditions, for better pay, for regular pay, etc. That's what unions are, and unions are interested because they've lost quite a lot of membership in the past years, and suddenly they find this pool of future due-paying members. And they're interested. For a long time they were not, because this was, especially for undocumented migrants, this was unfair competition to their members. They thought so. This is not the case anymore. Unions are interested, and we've seen that in many countries. Again, it's very recent, past 10 years at the most. But we can go even further than that. One problem we have is that migrants, vulnerable migrants, migrants in a precarious situation, fear talking to the authorities. Generally, because they could be detected, detained, and deported. And we have to give them confidence that talking to the authorities about their issues is actually something they can do without fear of being detected, detained, and deported. For example, labor inspectors. If you work in an environment that is unsafe or unhealthy, you might phone the labor inspector to ask them to come and check whether this workplace fits the regulations, because you have sufficient social capital to risk angering your employer on that, but it's your right. Migrants won't do that if the first reflex of labor inspectors is to check immigration papers. So in Quebec, for example, I know that labor inspectors do look for irregular migrants. And so they're never caught by migrants who work in unhealthy or unsafe conditions. And we should prohibit immigration inspectors from checking immigration papers. That's not their job. We have immigration enforcement for that. And they should do their job as well. And I'm not saying that they should not do their job. Immigration enforcement is there to enforce immigration laws. They should be well trained, they should be well provided for, they should be gender sensitive, human rights sensitive, but they have to implement their mission. But it's not the mission of a labor inspector to check immigration papers. It's a labor inspector should check health and safety regulations, should check that the place is safe for the workers. Same thing for social workers. Same thing for school directors, healthcare workers. Healthcare workers almost everywhere in Canada refuse to denounce undocumented migrants. Why? Because if they start doing it, undocumented migrants will not come back to the hospital, to the clinic, to their office. And they will end up in emergency room when it's way too late to do anything. And that's not the result that healthcare workers want. So healthcare workers don't want to denounce these people. Many municipal police forces in the US have requested their municipal authorities to prohibit them from asking immigration papers. Why? Because municipal police forces have a mission: serve and protect, law and order. They want to be able to work with the community to fight crime. They want an undocumented migrant to not fear calling the police when there are gunshots next door, or when there's family violence at home, or when there's violence against children. They want to be able to work with these people. If you have in any American city or Canadian city 15% of the population that will never call the police, well, you have a problem. You have a community police problem. You don't have the trust of the community. And that's why these municipal forces have asked the municipal authorities, for political, nationalist, populist reasons, the states of Alabama and Arizona have passed laws to prohibit the cities from prohibiting their police force from asking for immigration papers. Interesting how this plays out. But that's what the police forces have been asking. They want to work with the community. So that's what I call firewalls. Firewalls between public services and immigration enforcement, to allow the voice of the migrant to reach the authorities and to allow these authorities to do something which is within their mission. And this does not prevent immigration enforcement from doing its job. You had a good example here in Ontario a few weeks ago about Transport Ontario stopping cars on the roadside to check for a technical defect in the cars. And when they saw a pickup truck with many dark-skinned men, they called their CBSA friends, which were on the roadside a little farther, to check their immigration papers. There was a big hullabaloo here, and after a few weeks, Transport Ontario said that they were severing all cooperation links with CBSA, the Canadian Border Services Agency. To me, this is a firewall. Suddenly, Transport Ontario was risking seeing pickup trucks trying to evade the control. And that's a dangerous thing to do. The objective of Transport Ontario is to check cars, not to be an auxiliary to immigration enforcement. And that's what I call firewalls. And this exists. Portugal was very proud of announcing, when I presented my report a year and a half ago to the Human Rights Council, Portugal was very proud of saying that they had in the Ministry of Social Affairs, they had a database of all children of undocumented migrants so that they could provide services, money, resources to schools and hospitals for them, and that this database was inaccessible to immigration enforcement. And they said, this is a firewall, and we're very proud of it because it works. It works. In Montreal, if you want to register a kid to school, you have to show your immigration papers. Otherwise, you can't register, contrary to what happens, for example, in Toronto. So we probably have several hundreds of kids in Montreal who don't go to school because the parents don't know how to get their kids to school. And we also know that some directors don't apply the rule and don't ask for immigration papers. So you also have that, which is an interesting element. The whole point here is that migrants, like any one of us, should be empowered to exercise their rights. It doesn't mean that they have the right to stay. It doesn't mean that they're protected from deportation. It simply means that they have rights way beyond deportation. Migrant kids should be able to go to school. Maybe there will be a deportation order at one point, but that's not a school problem. That's an immigration problem. Let immigration deal with it. So the empowerment, the capacity to speak up for your own rights, which is the only thing that has ever worked. Rights have never been granted to us by anyone else. Women know that. Aboriginals know that. Gays and lesbians know that. They have had to fight for their rights by themselves and speak up. Get out of the closet and speak up and fight for that every day. And still we have sexist stereotypes and we have anti-gay stereotypes. But this is a fight of every day. But if you don't have a voice anywhere, it's not going to happen. No one's going to help you. So if we want the migrants to be able to affirm their rights without denying state territorial sovereignty, we need to empower them. And that's what I call sometimes the idea of local citizenship. You've heard that New York City has decided to provide ID cards to all the residents of New York City, whatever their immigration status. As long as you're a resident, you have this ID card, which provides you with a series of services, allows you to obtain a number of things. This is what I call local citizenship, and that's where I think we are going to have to, at one point, distinguish between nationality and citizenship, and recognize that you could be a citizen of a country without being a national of a country, and that the two are not necessarily the same. And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Crépeau, for a wonderful talk, very powerful, very stimulating talk. Hopefully it's going to encourage lots of questions.
Hopefully.
Yes. We're going to take questions from audience members at the two microphones on the side in just a few minutes, and we're also going to be taking questions from Twitter. We've been broadcasting this webcast as well, so we'll be having those come in. But perhaps I can ask a few questions just to kick things off and get us started. First of all, one of the things I wanted to say is just it's really wonderful to have somebody in your stature, in an official position as Special Rapporteur, speaking in the language of human rights, thinking about migration in the language of human rights. I think that's really rare. We don't hear that enough, and so it's really wonderful to have that. And, you know, we're just much more inundated, I think, when we hear media reports every day about migration as a security threat, whether it's the spread of disease, whether it's taking jobs away from nationals, whether it's the threat of terrorism. And as you pointed out, governments really play off of that in terms of nationalist populist discourse. And they've, as you've mentioned, present migration quite often as a security threat that needs to be stopped. And as you've also pointed out, I think, in your talk, one of the things we really see is that this security framework, it actually really forces migrants into more precarious modes, more into, you know, creating the very problem which they're supposed to be preventing, irregular migration. It fuels an economy of smuggling. It strengthens economic sectors, which really, as you've pointed out, benefit from the low wages of migrant labor, from the exploitation of migrant labor. And so I guess the question that I want to ask you. I mean, it seems at so many levels that this security approach to migration is fundamentally at odds with the human rights framework. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of your own personal role as Special Rapporteur, what is it that you, when you meet government officials, what is it that you say, what is it that you can do to really shift their way of approaching migration from one of security to human rights?
I wish I knew. I mean, that's where the limitations of the human rights discourse hit. I often feel that I'm politely listened to and not heard. What I often do is I try to stress what the grassroots people in the country whom I meet when I do visits, what the grassroots people are doing, how there is a solidarity movement that has emerged, how people are helping, how there are lawyers that are doing a great job at helping these people obtain statuses. So not all of those people who are without status are not able to obtain a status. They simply don't have the social capital to access anyone who can help them to obtain that status. And so I'm trying to stress the fact that national human rights institutions in the country are doing a good job, trying to do inquiries, trying to protect some people, trying to, for example, ombudspersons will negotiate with administrations for placing the kids in schools, for obtaining this and that. So there's lots of goodwill and lots of work that is already being done at grassroots level. And I'm trying to stress that, to show them that this is who they are too. It's not simply the anti-immigration discourse that we hear very often. And I'm telling them that the type of recommendations I make, because I make recommendations to government, are there to help them, and I tell them that I'm available for technical cooperation afterwards if they need help implementing. But I also tell them that this report that I will make about the country and its difficulties and the recommendations I make will be taken up by civil society in the country. I mean, civil society, 1, 2, 3 years after my report, will ask the minister, well, 3 years ago the special rapporteur said that. What happened since then? Why didn't you do anything? International organizations will tell the government about my report, and it's not simply my report, it's my report, the several reports by the treaty bodies, like the Human Rights Committee or the Committee on the Rights of the Child. We all feed into each other's language and discourse. I quote what the Committee on the Rights of the Child has said about Greece in my report to Greece, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child 3 years later will quote what I've said on how children are treated in Greece. So we feed and we create a counter discourse that is carried also by local NGOs, by international NGOs, by advocates everywhere. So that is, I think, something that they're sensitive to. Very often what I found is that people in ministerial positions are not racist. Some of them may be, but as a whole they're not racist. They would like to do the right thing, but not at the cost of the next election. So if we provide them with tools, with a language, with ideas that could help them do the right thing and win the next election, it's a win-win situation. I haven't found that equation yet, really. But certainly I can bring forward a number of things. I can tell them that they have allies. I can tell them that there is good work being done, that more things can be done. So that's what I'm trying to do. Unfortunately, if I deal with a democratic country, I might be able to mobilize, some political parties, not many. If you are in an undemocratic country like Qatar, for example, well, it obeys completely different rules in terms of how political decisions are taken, and that's more difficult.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question, I know you didn't have time to touch on it a lot tonight, so maybe I ask you that, is about the deaths at sea and crossing the Mediterranean Sea. I've just come back from Lesbos, one of the islands off of Turkey, Greek island, and one of the things that I think you've talked about, which really struck me, is the way that as part of this global migration system, we also have the European system, and the way this is really based on forcing border countries like Greece to to pick up a certain burden of controlling the borders of the EU, and through the Dublin system, of course, of having refugees have to apply at the first country they enter into. And of course, we know countries like Greece, particularly after the economic crisis, are just really incapable of dealing with this. And when you see the amount of people coming through on that particular, very small site, I think I was told 2,000 people had come through in October, which is just huge. They don't have the capacity to actually even deal with that. And, it is amazing to see the community, the local community there, taking care of that and helping the migrants. But I guess one of the questions that I'm wondering is, so we see this system and we see then there's a kind of, people are coming through the southern Mediterranean, and we see this is leading to increased deaths at sea, shipwrecks. I think lots of people know about the Lampedusa last year in October, where at least 366 migrants died at sea. And then there was recently, 2 weeks ago, off of the coast of Istanbul, a boat with 27 people. So this is something we're hearing much more. And so on the one hand, we have institutes like the International Organization of Migration that just produced that recent report on fatal journeys, in which it's noting the alarming problem of deaths at sea. I think they're saying that some 3,000 in this past year have died at sea, and that's up from 700 in 2013. So it's a huge alarming note, and they're calling for something needing to be done. And at the same side, we have countries like the UK who have just said, recently that we're not going to support search and rescue teams across the Mediterranean. So I'm wondering what you see with this kind of impasse. What's the way forward? What should the EU be doing? What should the international community be doing? What should we as citizens be doing in terms of really preventing further tragedies like this from happening?
Yeah. During the 50s and 60s, millions of Africans, essentially North Africans, crossed the Mediterranean, and there was not one single death. And we can't say that in the 50s and 60s there were no borders. I mean, there was even, you had to change your whole wallet of, the currency every time you crossed the border in Europe. You had to go from liras to florins to francs to Deutschmark. All the time, borders meant something. And there were border guards. But it was not forbidden to cross the Mediterranean. You took the ferry in Algiers and you just, disembarked in Marseille. And you were controlled, your papers were controlled, but it was not forbidden for you to come. You may not have the right to work, you may not have the right to stay more than 3 months because you're a visitor, but it was not forbidden to come. So people didn't die. They just took the ferry. Nowadays, states have decided that they have to control immigration, and in order to do that, they have erected barriers, saying that, no, you can't take the ferry anymore, nor the plane. Can't do that. It's over. So what do people do? Well, people still do come, because they need to come, because we need them to, our underground labor markets in particular, and they do come. And so, paradoxically, in the name of controlling borders, erecting barriers, we have actually lost the control of the border, because the control of the border is in the hands of the smugglers. The big wall that was built between Mexico and the US hasn't prevented 50,000 youth from Central America to come to the US last summer. We put a big wall, and it doesn't work. And it cannot work. Democratic borders are porous. I have yet to hear one single politician say that. It's, people will come. If we want to regain control of the border, we should allow them to come, organize the ferries, register them, have them pay the money to get on the ferry, and then we control. Then we know. We know who's there. We know for how long. And they know that they have the right to be there. They don't fear the authorities. I had this interesting anecdote, which I told you before, about being on the beaches of Djibouti. Djibouti is across from Yemen, and there's the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb in between. It's about 35 nautical miles. And it is the point of passage of it was 2 years ago, it has diminished a bit, but it was the point of passage of about 100,000 people who were going to become irregular migrants in Saudi Arabia for the most part, coming from Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti. And all this was run by smugglers. And it was estimated that on the 100,000, about 10% were dying every year in the strait because it's treacherous waters. And so I was on this beach with someone from the International Organization for Migration next to me. And I said, but why don't your organization buy 4 Norwegian ferries and you establish a system to cross here? You know, that would mean that instead of paying 5,000 euros to the smugglers, they would pay 100 euros per person to get on the ferry. But that would also mean that they would queue up. And during their time of queuing up, you check their papers, you check if people are in need of protection, in need of health care, you check if there are minors that are in need of protection, you check if there are people who are victims of trafficking. You know, you check all this. And we know who goes across. And we know they arrive safely. And you would have saved already 10,000 lives just by doing this. And the system could, you know, fund itself. You know, if 100 euros is not enough, you know, make it 300 euros, 500 euros. It's still 10 times less than the 5,000 euros they're paying now. Why don't you do that? And the answer was a little smile of silence, and then I don't think the member states of IOM would approve. That was it. There's no political will to facilitate mobility, when mobility is the only answer. If you facilitate mobility and control it, because you ask for papers, but people are not. Remember how the border between Canada and the US was when we were young. I'm talking to those of my generation here. You remember the only question that the American border guard would ask? No? All Canadians? Go. I was at, my parents had a cottage near Phillipsburg, which is the border crossing, and that was the only question that was asked. All Canadians, go, period. Facilitating, maybe we should do a little more than that, but facilitating border crossing, facilitating mobility, controlling mobility, but facilitating it. That's the way. And that's what I'm telling European governments. If you want less deaths in the Mediterranean, let people come. Control that, but let them come. At the moment, the control of the crossing of the Mediterranean is not in your hands. It's in the hands of the mafias. If you want to take back from the mafias, you have to kill their business model. And their business model is founded on the barrier that you've erected. Take away the barrier, the whole business model crumbles. And you take back the control of the passage. I don't think any one of them is ready to do that now. I just hope that this will instill an idea that can grow over the years and finally convince a few people, maybe years from now, maybe our kids will do that. Who knows?
And you're going to be working on this and producing another report on this issue.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to, in December, I'm going to Italy and Malta, and I'm going to, in February, I'll be going to Spain and to Brussels to discuss with European authorities. And I want to produce a report on deaths at sea in the Mediterranean in order to provide this new commission that will have taken hold, that will have taken power in Brussels with a series of ideas as they are beginning to plan their work for the coming period.
Super, thank you. We'll look forward to reading
Pleasure.
that. Yeah. Maybe we can get some questions from audience members. I would ask you to come down to the microphone. And if you can briefly state your name and just identify yourself, that would be great. And maybe while people are coming down to ask questions, I can just take one from the Twitter here. What role can diasporas play in empowering migrants and breaking down fear of the other?
That's a very good question.
Yes.
Very good question. I take it here that diasporas are people, that the way the question is phrased, that diasporas are actually people who are of X origin but are now citizens, or a group of people who are mixed, who have gained citizenship. Part of them have gained citizenship, part of them have permanent residence status, etc. I think that diasporas can do a lot in order to establish mechanisms to help people of the same origin obtain status, retain status, regain status, and that mobilizing those diasporas is important. The reason why in the US we actually have a real debate, a real political debate, and we really have one side that wants to protect the human rights of a number of undocumented migrants, is precisely because we have a diaspora. I mean, out of the 11 million undocumented migrants in the US, between 8 and 9 are Mexicans. And you have a huge Mexican-American community that has citizenship and votes, and they have senators and representatives, and they are a huge community, and they care, and their vote is at stake. And so that's why I think the Democrats, the Democratic Party in the US, is courting this vote and is trying to change things, and the Obama announcement of tonight that you are missing, and I'm missing, is important. But that's because there is a diaspora, because there is a community that cares, and there's a community that votes and whose vote politicians are courting. We don't really have that in Canada. We don't have this sizable one diaspora that dominates. We have many diasporas which probably do not have electoral size or electoral importance enough. But diasporas can do a lot, and I think mobilizing them and working with them in order to solve the issues of people of the same origin would be an extremely important thing if we could get rid of the portrayal of irregular migrants as being a threat or something that we should get rid of.
Thank you. Take a question from the audience. Yes.
Yep.
Hi, my name's Cheta Mainwaring. I'm an assistant professor at UW and here at Balsillie. And thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was wondering about, you talked about how national governments, politicians see this cost associated with giving migrant rights, and how migrant bashing has become a way to win elections, and the importance of electoral pressure in this whole process. So I wondered, as well as thinking about change at the international level and the national level, how we change things at the grassroots and local level so that kind of rhetoric isn't so effective. So I suppose my questions are, why do you think it's so effective, and how can we change that?
I think that's something that I've partly addressed by the issue by the idea of local citizenship, for example. The fact that cities are actually interested in working with the whole of the community. And generally, cities are where migrants are. Migrants are not in rural communities, not much. They may be, but not much. Migrants go to cities, mostly, because that's where there is a network that could exist for them, and that's where the employment opportunities are. Cities could be, to me, are the place where we can create goodwill towards migrants. That's where it's that level of political debate which is very close to the communities, where people actually understand what migration is, because their neighbor is in dire straits and they like the neighbor. Or because the sister of the people they work with every day wants to come to Canada and is in a country at war, and your coworker can't bring her in. And so you're sensitive to her plight, to the plight of your coworker. So you understand at close range what these issues are, and you suddenly identify. They're not otherized by being portrayed as problems and threats, and because you haven't met them. Very often when you see anti-Muslim reactions, like in Quebec, the famous charter of Hérouville in 2006, well, that was a village that had never seen a Muslim in its whole existence. And they had this fantasy of veiled women, being a problem. this, at city level, this often doesn't happen. And I think if we can push our city officials, for example, in Toronto, the school board that decided no, don't ask, don't tell, to me, that's the right level. We're talking about people who meet the kids in the school boards, people who meet the parents, and people who are at grassroots level. That is, I think, a place where cities could play a much bigger role, and where associations of cities, associations of mayors, could play a much bigger role in pushing their national governments to change their stance. Pleasure.
Great. Maybe as we're waiting for other questions, I'll take one more from Twitter.
Yeah.
Very topical. Do you think Obama's executive action on immigration was the right course of action, or does acting unilaterally threaten a possible future consensus? And this is from Jeff from Waterloo.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for the question. Do you have an answer to that question? I don't think anyone has an answer to that question. I think President Obama sees, well, from what I observe, and I have no more insight than you have in this room, and Jeff, who's probably looked at the Obama address of tonight. I mean, I think Obama sees that as part of his legacy. It certainly is going to anger the Republican Party, and we're hearing of lawsuits and all sorts of reactions. Is it going to threaten a possible future consensus? I think the word that strikes me here is possible. Is there any consensus possible? At present, there doesn't seem, I mean, every consensus has been sort of explored in the past 3-4 years, and nothing has come out. I tend to be in line with the New York Times in their editorial this morning, which says, let's do something about it and see what happens. That would be he's going to do something about it. It'll help 4 to 5 million people. That's a huge number. People who will not have to, not take the metro or the subway in the morning in order not to be asked for their papers when they exit the metro. People who will try not to go out at night too late, because if they're singled out on the sidewalk, they might be asked for their papers. You know, people who live in fear. I think that freeing from fear 5 million people and allowing them to pursue their activities, which many of them, the Dreamers in particular, they've only known the US as their country. That's the country they've always lived. They came to the US age 3, age 6, that's their country. If we free them from the fear and allow them to, deploy their potential for the greater benefit of the American economy and culture, I think that will be a great legacy in itself. Whether it creates a further rift between the two parties, I think is, doesn't add much to the present situation anyway. The funny story I've heard, which I've told you already before the conference, is that one of the funny reactions to this was Obama must really hate Hillary Clinton because he's going to leave that mess on her lap, as she will be trying to obtain fight for the presidency if she is on the Democratic ticket. So, well, that was a funny reaction.
I think we have one more coming down.
There's one more question here.
Hi, my name is Carol. I'm a retired history teacher, and I get confused about this whole immigration issue in that Canada is a huge empty country, and we aren't even replacing ourselves with our birth rate. We're dependent on immigration. We're also a country living next door to the USA that resents being the little brother. If we're going to, compete, we need to have people. So I just don't understand why we aren't encouraging immigration. am I just being too naive here?
Thank you for the question. I think your question illustrates quite well the discrepancy between what politicians say and what social science tells us. I mean, politicians repeat constantly what, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen said 30 years ago about France. He said, 2 million immigrants, 2 million unemployed. Meaning, if we throw them out, we'll have full employment. It's a ridiculous idea in economic terms. It doesn't make sense. It's, and all social sciences have demonstrated in the past 30 years that migrants don't take jobs. They create jobs, except for specific pockets, usually at the bottom of the scale. But apart from those specific pockets, migrants who come don't take jobs, they create jobs. Yet, this is what we hear. And I'm convinced that the majority of the population of the global north is convinced that too many immigrants will take jobs. Social science says the contrary. And we can't get politicians to acknowledge that. And I repeat, as long as the voices of migrants themselves will not be heard, we will not be able to dispel those stereotypes, those myths, those fantasies. Like we had myths and fantasies about women. Women can't drive. Women are too emotional to be CEO. Women shouldn't be conducting orchestras. Stupid things that we thought were true collectively. And it's been demonstrated by women doing the country than what we thought that it's not true. And if we don't do the same type of process, not allow the migrants to speak for themselves and show for themselves what they're capable of, those myths, those fantasies will remain. Because those myths, those threats, those fantasies are electorally paying for the politicians who use them. They win points at the polls every time they utter the threats, the fantasies, and it's difficult to get a rational debate when the first persons concerned are not even debating with us at the table. We won't change the myths and the fantasies if migrants don't come forward. And that's why I think we need to help them find their voice, and we need to have people who carry their voice so that we can say the contrary of what politicians are saying everywhere to win our votes. I'm a bit hopeful in the sense that I think that the media, and I'm not thinking about Fox News or the conservative or the Republican-led media in the US, but I would say the mainstream public media in Canada, in the US, the BBC, in Deutsche Welle, Radio France, all these public media, I think they've got the message. I think they're much more sophisticated today in their approach to immigration issues than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they didn't know anything. They would ask stupid questions, like my star journalist of Radio-Canada. Why are the migrants benefiting from the charter? I thought they were illegals. That's pretty stupid for someone who's so highly regarded. But I think he wouldn't say that today. I think the media is much more sophisticated today, has a better grasp. It doesn't prevent the media from being politically oriented, but if you take mainstream media, I think it's much better than it used to be. I've participated, for example, recently in a 3-day training program for top-level executives, and that means, head of Europe division, head of Arabic division of Al Jazeera. And it was organized by the International Labour Organization. And it was 3 days of training of their top executives throughout the world on temporary migrant work and how to deal with that. Why? Because Al Jazeera is interested in the Gulf region, and in the Gulf region you have millions of temporary migrant workers who are very badly exploited, and they wanted to get better at reporting this. That gives me hope. If the media can report better, if those voices, if the voices of those migrants who are exploited can be, sent to us viewers through a better, more sophisticated media discourse, I think we're making progress.
Perhaps we have time for 2 more questions. Jenna?
Hi there. Thank you very much. I'm Jenna Hennebree, the director of the International Migration Research Center here at Balsillie School. You talk about this idea of local citizenship and the idea that we can have solutions at local levels, right? Yep. So is that because you've sort of given up at the international levels? We have the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families, and it's signed by mostly sending countries, right? We know this. We have mechanisms at national levels and at provincial levels, such as Supreme Courts, that have done things like not upheld the rights of migrant workers to be able to unionize in Ontario in agriculture. So we have local mechanisms. So is the solution then access at the local level? If it is, then are you not concerned about the differentiation between access to services, social protections, and rights? And what does that mean for actually grave exploitation and actually solving that piece of the puzzle? Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a complicated question. Yeah, but that's okay. I mean, I haven't given up at all. I've told you that there's a silver lining at international level. I think that states at top level, ministerial level and high level civil servant level, they understand that they have a problem, that they haven't been able to find the discourse, the type of discourse that will allow them to answer the issues and win the elections. And they have to find something, because the nationalist populist parties and movements have dominated the agenda for 30 years, and it's enough. We need to find a counter discourse that actually works politically. And I think that at international level, this is what is being slowly built. That bits and pieces of discourse that states could agree upon would make sense, and that they could draw from there into their national political debate. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. At local level, I think there's so much goodwill from civil society, but also from local officials who actually know the people they're dealing with, be they police officers or welfare agents or whomever. They know the people, they know the families they're dealing with. Social workers know the families they're dealing with. And they're not really interested in their immigration status, except if the immigration status has an impact on their health or on their socialization, for kids, for example. Same thing for school. School teachers are not interested in the immigration status of the kids. They want the kids to grow, and to grow healthy and intelligent and brilliant and develop their capacities. And I think we should draw upon that. We should draw from that. The problem we have is that we haven't found a way to represent those people at national level. And we have here an electoral system, which is the best system we've ever invented, so let's not criticize it too much, but which does not represent the people that are at stake here. And that's a sizable population. So we have something here which is key. I mean, the political stage in our countries are an important stage in terms of defining who you are and what happens to you. But we need to attack it from the top, from the bottom, and try to create a form of citizenship. And I'm very happy about the initiative of New York City and Mayor de Blasio. I think that's exactly the kind of message that local politicians, mind you, New York is a big local place, local politicians can send to national politicians saying, you have a problem with immigration? I don't. They're part of my community. They bring, ideas, creativity. I don't care whether they have the right to be here or not. That's not my problem. You want to make a problem of it? Your problem. I'm working with everyone who is in my community. I think that type of message is extremely positive. It encourages a lot of civil society initiatives. It allows them to flourish. And this is the kind of thing that might work. Mind you, when I was in Greece, because of the debt crisis, I've met numerous local civil society organizations and national human rights institution, the Human Rights Commission of Greece, and none of them had any budget anymore. They all functioned as volunteers, which meant that they had very few hours because they still had to feed their family. So they had very few hours to dedicate. So probably 2/3 of the NGO network that helped migrants in Greece had disappeared in the debt crisis. And when you have that, well, you don't have the tools at local level to do anything. So those who were doing something at grassroots level in Greece when I was there were mostly international NGOs whose money would be funneled into Greece, or international organizations. So outsiders. And that's problematic.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Maysa Mustafa. I'm a PhD student at Balsil School. I will shift the discussion a bit and consider another category of migrants who are the refugees. My question is, if in order to protect the human rights of refugees and stateless people, I was thinking about your suggestion of empowerment of migrants and give them the agency to have voice. How can we apply that to refugees?
I think for refugees, and especially for the Syrians in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, the Eritreans in many countries bordering the Mediterranean, and many Central Americans as well who are victims of violence. I think we need to reinstate major refugee resettlement programs, to send them the message that we can and we will resettle them, like we did for the Indo-Chinese. We sent out a message of hope for the Indo-Chinese, mind you, after several years, but we still did it at the Paris agreements in 79, 80. And we sent a message of hope. And we told them, okay, you can line up here and we'll take, millions of you. And that's what we did. There are at present, I think, 3 million Syrians in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And I don't see why Australia plus New Zealand plus 28 European countries plus Canada plus the US would not announce that they're taking 1 or 2 million refugees in the next 5 years. If you divide this by 5 years and you divide this by 28 European countries plus Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, it's not that, and you proportionately to the population, it's not that many people. We can do it. It means mobilizing resources, for sure. But these people, those refugees, when you see how Indo-Chinese have settled in Canada, and when you see their kids in our universities succeeding at studies, etc., you tell yourself, these are perfect citizens. That's exactly what we want. And I don't see why, Syrian refugees or Eritrean refugees would not do the same, would not strive as well. But we have to send a message of hope. If we don't do that, let's try to put ourselves in their shoes. You are a couple, you have 2 daughters, or a daughter and a son. They, when you left Syria 3 years ago, they were 12 and 14. They're now 15 and 17. It's their formative years. They haven't been to school for 3 years, or barely. You want to provide them with a future, and you know that if you wait another 3 years, it's over. 6 years without school when you're a teenager, it's over. You won't be back to school. You'll have to do something else. What do you do as parents? Oh, you pay a smuggler. I would bet my shirt that this is what the majority of us in this room would do if we were in the shoes of those parents. We'd pay a smuggler. And it's absolutely normal. If it's the only way to get to a proper school for our kids, that's what you do. So, if we want to avoid this, because we're putting these people in the hands of the smugglers, we're creating the market for the smugglers and for the exploitation and for the death at sea. If we want to avoid that, and we want to send a message of hope, we have to kill the business model, I've told it, but you have to, do as we did for the Indo-Chinese who were in the camps in Hong Kong or Thailand. You open an office, you line up people, you take names, and you select with UNHCR the people who are most in need and able to resettle. You resettle families, you resettle people with disabilities, you resettle, you try to, and you do that in partnership with other countries. And in that way, you reduce considerably the flow of, and you see I use liquid language myself, the flow of irregular migrants, and you reduce considerably the dangers of crossing seas, etc. Because people will line up. They will wait for another 6 months if they know that there's a door that opens. And as long as there's no doors, they will find the opening through their own means. And I think we should do that today. We should not wait. I find the debate in Canada that's been going on for weeks about how many dozens of Syrian refugees we've accepted ridiculous. It's not a dozen or 6 dozens of refugees that count. Sweden, with a population of 9 million, I think now, has taken 30,000 Syrian refugees. And we're arguing as to whether we've filled our quota of 1,300. I think we are way, way off the mark. We should do a much, much better job. And I think that the European Union has a leadership role that it's not taken yet. Sweden has shown the way. Germany has followed. I think Germany has accepted 20,000 Syrians now. So they show the way ahead. And I'm sure that they hoped that other European countries would follow suit, and it's not happened. And so we are failing morally and politically on that count, and we are going to pay the price. But before we are going to pay the price, those people are going to pay the price, and that's a tragedy.
Professor Crépeau, thank you so much for sharing your, your expertise and experience and empathy with us tonight at CG and Balsillie School of International Affairs. Please join me in a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A few quick comments before we adjourn. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who participated tonight, Suzanne Ilkin, the introducer, Kim Reigel, the moderator, the Balsillie School for making this night possible, and especially then, again, Dr. Crépeau, you helped to dispel the myths of migrants and pointed out that they have human rights. You are a very worthy recipient of the title of UN Rapporteur because you're a very clear communicator. You pointed out that we're all migrants in some sense of the word, born in one place, living in another, traveling. And I think you also helped us to make a journey in our view tonight of migrants, helped us to see them as ourselves with all the attendant human rights. So thank you again for all of that and to the entire group. The video of this evening's webcast will be posted to the CG website, and we'll have a blog there where you can also post your own comments if you like. And in the coming weeks, we invite you to join us for 2 more public events here in the auditorium. On Thursday, November 27th, we welcome you to join us for our next signature lecture titled Violence and Remembrance, What Memorializing Our Historical Heroes and Victims Tells Us About Who We Are Now. And the speaker is Ed Linenthal. He's the editor of the Journal of American History and a professor of history at Indiana University. And on December 9th, we'll be screening Our Man in Tehran. This is part of our CG Cinema series, and this 2013 film documents the events leading up to the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis and details of the rescue. Think of it as the true version of the Hollywood film Argo. So be sure to register online for our events newsletter to receive information on all of our upcoming events. Thank you for coming to CG tonight. Please mind the snow and the ice and have a safe journey home.
In Paris, he was a star, and he was doing this piece on undocumented migrants in Montreal. And I told him, well, migrants benefit from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and he turns around and says, how come they benefit from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? I thought they were illegals. So if this star journalist of Radio-Canada didn't get it, it's counterintuitive for many of us. Migrants have all the rights, the fundamental rights of the citizen, because we're all humans, and except 2, the right to vote and be elected, and the right to enter and stay in the country. These are 2 rights which are reserved to citizens in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All other rights are for everyone. without exception. This includes the right to equality, being treated the same. Which means that if we create distinctions based on nationality or immigration status, we have to justify it. Otherwise, it is a discrimination, and it is forbidden in international law and in constitutional law. So there's a right there for migrants as for everyone else. This doesn't mean that we all have the same entitlements in terms of government programs. I don't have the right to my pension. I don't fit the age criteria yet. It's coming, but not yet. I don't have the right to prenatal care. I'm not a woman, and I'm not pregnant. I mean, there are criteria for entitlements, government program entitlements. But the fundamental rights, we are all on the same plane except for those two limited rights that I've mentioned. And this stems from the idea that the migrant's dignity is not different from ours. The idea that we can't be tortured, the idea that we must be treated equally unless there's a good reason for it, and the one who wants to treat us unequally has to prove it. That we have the right to, due process, that we have the right to an education. Why should migrant kids not have the right to go to school? What have they done to be deprived of something which is key to the development they need now for the rest of their lives? We can't say, oh, when they'll get back home, they'll have their education. No, it's now they need to learn to write and read and count. The third idea is that irregular migration is not a crime. It is portrayed as a crime in the political discourse. The irregular migrant is criminalized, is presented as part of a criminal activity. It certainly is a violation of an administrative regulation. You're supposed to go through a normal entry point and to present the appropriate documents to enter the country. Or you're supposed to go back home after
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation. My name is Fred Kuntz, and I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs here at CG. Thanks to everyone here tonight for coming out amid the first real blast of Canadian winter. I congratulate you on your hardiness. I'd also like to thank our public event sponsor, Wordsworth Books, for their ongoing support of the CG Signature Lecture Series. This evening's lecture is also co-sponsored by the Balsley School of International Affairs, and we thank them for their contributions. We also thank everyone who's joining us live online through the CG Live webcast. Following this evening's address, we welcome questions from both audiences here in the auditorium, at the microphones at the ends of the aisles, or through the live chat function on your screen if you're at home. Please remember to state your name and to keep the questions brief. Canada's migrant policies have received heavy criticism in recent days for the treatment of migrants from countries with widespread and persistent intense transmission of the Ebola virus. The fear-based discourse perpetuates a familiar political message, framing migrants as security risks. Tonight, Dr. François Crépeau will speak to us about shifting migrant discourse and policies to help create engaged and empowered migrant communities. Dr. Crépeau will also discuss the progress made toward a comprehensive governance framework for global migration. Here to introduce tonight's speaker, we'll have Suzanne Ilken, Director of the Master of Arts in Global Governance Program and Professor at the Balsley School of International Affairs. And following the lecture, Kim Reigel, Associate Professor at the Balsley School, will moderate the question and answer period. Suzanne Ilken teaches in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of Waterloo, in addition to her roles at the BSIA. Her research interests include poverty and social policy, humanitarian aid and refugee camps, and social justice and citizenship rights. Kim Reigel is faculty of Wilfrid Laurier University and teaches in the Master of International Public Policy program at the Balsley School. She's also a research associate with Laurier's International Migration Research Center. We look forward to her moderation later in the evening. So please join me now in welcoming Suzanne to introduce the speaker.
Good evening. Thank you, Fred. Many of us will have heard in the news recently about such recent events as the federal court's decision declaring unconstitutional the Government of Canada's cuts to health care for refugees, or about the growing number of migrants fleeing war and economic hardship and facing hazardous journeys, sometimes death, as they try to cross into Europe. The European Union is not automatically accompanied by the assurance of the legal guarantees and basic human rights protection for detainees. He has called for alternatives to detention, for the necessity to learn from migrants themselves, and for them to form a political constituency, and for the recognition that all migrants are rights holders, such as having the right to health, education, due process within the law, and the right not to be tortured. Dr. Crépeau has given many conference addresses. He has published numerous articles, books, and reports. His research has focused on migration control mechanisms, the boundary between security and migration, the interface between the rule of law and globalization, and the rights and freedoms of migrants. Please join me in welcoming Dr. François Crépeau.
Many thanks, Susan, for this generous introduction. I'd like to thank the organizers, Fred Kuntz in particular, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you in this bad weather. Although it's the beginning of winter, it's still nice to see snow. Won't last. You've learned quite a lot of what I do already. I've titled my presentation Between Myths and Crises, Rethinking Migration Policies. I will guide you through a series of ideas about why we are not thinking properly about migration policies. What are the angles that we're not seeing when we're talking about migration policies? And why the migration policies we are adopting and implementing are certainly in many cases and in many countries missing completely the issue of protecting the human rights of migrants who are in a precarious situation. My UN mandate is about the human rights of migrants, and I'm interested in particular in two categories of migrants who have a very precarious status: undocumented migrants and temporary migrant workers. In both cases, they have either no status or a very precarious status, which creates enormous problems for them to affirm and protect their own human rights. Am I doing this right? Is it on? No, it's not on. Got it. Yep. Very quickly, the first point I'd like to make is that we're all migrants. This is sort of counterintuitive. We say that we're a country of migrants, yes. But we don't think of ourselves individually as migrants. We think of ourselves as settled. Because migration is often a generational issue. But if I ask the question, and I'm asking it to you, and I do that quite often with audiences, how many of you live today in the city of birth of your four-grandparents? I usually have one or two hands. Not many. We have an immigration, we all have in this room, I haven't seen one hand, we all have an immigration story from less than 2 generations. And if I ask the question about the country of origin of the four-grandparents, I usually have 2/3 of the audience who don't raise their hand. We're all migrants, and we don't think, it's counterintuitive. We think migrants are the others. We are the settled people. Settlement is civilization, migration, nomadic behavior is not quite civilization. It's a transition period. In fact, and that's my point here, migration is the normal state of mankind. That's what we've done since we came out, since we all issued from that African mother of all of us 200,000 years ago. We all come down from one single woman in Africa 200,000 years ago. And we've migrated throughout the planet. We've colonized Australia 60,000 years ago. We've colonized Europe about 40,000 years ago. We came to America, the Americas about 16,000 years ago. And we've migrated. We always do that. We go on holidays, we go on pilgrimage, we do internships, we go to college, we always move. But we don't see ourselves as migrants. The migrants are the others, those we see on TV. And therefore, migration is not the exception. It's settlement, which is the exception. We don't really consider that, but that's something that we should start thinking about. And this means that migration can't be stopped. Migration is in our genes. That's who we are. And it can't be stopped. It can be slowed, it can be diverted, but it can't be stopped. And there is somewhere here a contradiction with the dominant political discourse that we hear. Because up till now, there are democracy and development differentials on this planet. And people will always go to where there is less security and less economic stability, to places where they think they have better opportunities for themselves and their children. And this is just a normal and natural human behavior. And we'll have to adapt to this idea. My second point is that migrants have rights. That's also counterintuitive. I had a meeting with a very well-known French-Canadian journalist of Radio-Canada who had been correspondent in Washington.
Fortunate tonight to have Dr. François Crépeau with us to speak about such issues. Dr. Crépeau is a full professor and is the Hans and Tamar Professor in International Law in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He holds diplomas from McGill University, Bordeaux University, and Paris II University. He received his PhD in law from Paris I University. In 2011, he received a long-term appointment as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. This special appointment was first created in 1999 by the UN Commission on Human Rights. Its main functions include examining ways to overcome the obstacles to the protection of the human rights of migrants, recognizing the particular vulnerability of women, children, and undocumented persons. Also, collecting information on the violations of the human rights of migrants, and recommending actions at national, regional, and international levels to eliminate violations of the human rights of migrants. Today, there are some 232 million migrants. Some are forced to migrate as a result of poverty, discrimination, natural disasters, enormous conflict, and massive social unrest. During migration, and especially when crossing borders, many face exploitation, abuse, and other human rights violations. Dr. Crépeau's work focuses on these kinds of migrant and human rights abuses. In his capacity as Special Rapporteur, he has studied the UN Millennium Development Goals with respect to marginalized migrant populations and the challenges they face in terms of human rights abuses. He has also examined the management of the external borders of the European Union and its impact on the human rights of migrants. He held consultations with the European Union in Brussels and carried out visits to countries on both sides of the EU's external borders: Greece, Italy, Tunisia, and Turkey. In these countries, he visited detention centers, shelters, and other accommodations, as well as observing border crossings. Here, he witnessed inadequate procedures for detention, the detention of children and families, the prison-like conditions, and the criminalization of migrants for an irregular crossing or an attempt. Dr. Crépeau's human rights work has emphasized that the increasing practice of migration detention within and outside the